Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how I did this painting of a shark in acrylics. Now the first thing I like to do is work on my background. I usually find it easier to work with what is further away first and then build up from there. Now my first priority when painting a background is to get the white of the canvas covered up. So I'm just working with more of a darker blue. There is a hint of green here in this mixture as well. But you can see that I'm working from a really dark base layer. Now you can see that this layer looks considerably lighter, but it's just that it has dried. Now my preference of paint brand is Liquitex Basics, and they do dry with a matte finish, and therefore, as I say, it does look lighter. But once you apply a gloss varnish over the top, that painting will look how it did when the paint was wet. Now once I've got that established and the white of the canvas is completely covered, I can now start to build up my layers. Now in the real-time step-by-step version of this tutorial, I really do focus on how to use a fine mist spray bottle and blending brush techniques in order to create a soft out-of-focus background. And because the shark has no fur or feathers, anything that is overly textured and definitely far more smoother in appearance, this whole entire painting is going to focus on refining those blending techniques. So if that is something that you would like to see covered in more depth and very step by step, I'll link all of the information to my tutorials in the description below. Now what I'm starting to do here, you can see that from time to time I have a light misting of water that I'm applying first, or potentially at any times in that layering process. Now what I'm doing here is I'm either trying to slow that painting drying time down, or I add water first so that I've got something then to blend my wet paint into. Now if you try to blend wet paint into a dry surface or a drier layer, then that paint is not going to blend at all. Now what will happen is you'll start to get a darker ring around the area of wet paint that you're trying to blend. Now what's happening here is as that wet paint then meets an area of the drier canvas, it does start to then get stuck. So as you're trying to push that paint across, it physically can't do that because it has nothing wet to blend into. Which is why misting with water first, if you don't have a layer of wet paint initially, is a really good way of then ensuring that wet paint you're applying, as I am here, maintains that nice blurry edge. And I then continued with that layering process until I achieved the desired level of softness. Now I have switched over to a smaller round brush here so that I can indicate it more of those blurrier dots. This is more of that distant coral, so I didn't want to have too many defined edges. Now when it came to working on adjusting the colour, this is something that I do focus thoroughly on in all of my step-by-step tutorials, but I do also have a specific video here on YouTube where I'm talking about all of the different uses of glazing. Now glazing, as I am here, can just be used to adjust the colour, or you can use it to add softness, you can increase the depth and tonal values. So if that video on glazing is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now you'll see that I'll use glazing throughout this video and when I start the shark as well, and what I want to be achieving here is just simplifying that layering process. One of the most common questions I'm asked is, how do we know what colour to mix at each layer? Now this is a great question, but it is something that we don't have to worry about at each individual layer. We can focus more on the values and the contrast, which you will see in this video as we progress. And then once those layers are dry, you can then adjust that colour with a glaze. What this does is it helps to simplify those two aspects of painting, and then we can make that painting process much easier. Now as I progress onto starting the shark, this is where I want to focus first of all on creating a good base layer. Now all of my videos here on YouTube, this is something that I do focus on thoroughly. I want to be making sure that I don't have any harsh start and stop points, and that I've got that nice soft transition from light to dark or from one colour to the next. Now my first priority is not the detail, I can add that as I build my layers. It is purely so that I can start to hint at that shape and form by mapping in the accurate placement of the lights and the darks. Now I do feel the level of softness here is crucial, and that is regardless of the subject that we are painting. Even something that has lots of texture, a border terrier with more of a coarser, wiry fur, or even something like an owl with lots of ruffled feathers. It's at the base layer stage where we're going to maximize the level of depth, which will have that impact as we continue with that layering process. Now, once I'd established a smooth base layer, this is where I now need to start to focus more on adjusting the contrast. So here I'm coming in making sure my darks are dark enough and that my lights eventually are going to be bright enough. Now I say eventually because I don't want to be at this stage mapping in my brightest highlights first, but I don't want to be making my base layer too dark where my lighter highlights are going to be. Now, one of the wonderful things about working with acrylics is if we do make a base layer too dark, it really doesn't matter. We can wait for that layer to dry and then just lighten it with an additional layer. But it will make that painting process longer. But that isn't something that I personally overly worry about. And this is where I'm really starting to enhance more of my lighter values. Now, because this is a smoother texture, as I say, there's no fur or feathers, I can work more with adding in my lighter layers now. If I was working with something that had more texture, then I would be adding more of that detail for my darker foundations first, and then building in my highlights. But when working with something that is a smoother texture, we can add these more subtle lighter layers a little bit earlier on in that layering process. But something that is really important is we can only start to add our lighter layers once we've got those base layers, those darker values in place first. If you do realise that the layer underneath is not dark enough, it's best to go back in, add a glaze to darken it. It only takes a matter of seconds in some cases. Wait for that to dry and then start adding in your highlights as I am here. But my biggest tip as well with this is don't jump into your brightest highlights too soon. This is a gradual layering process and we are adding in a lighter value with each layer that we add. I haven't jumped in here with bright titanium white. I want to be making sure that this is a very subtle layering process here. It really is going to maximise that level of realism. Now, one of the key aspects of painting realism is making sure that the highlights and shadows are in the right place. This is just as important as everything else. The reason being that the highlights and shadows are not random, they do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. Now, it also follows the light source. I want to be making sure that if there is any slight variation in that placement, if there is a highlight that is particularly brighter than somewhere else, that I do have that in my painting. This is going to add so much additional depth when the painting is finished. Now, this is a smaller painting. This is only a 5 by 7 inch, so I do need to be realistic with how much I can include here. But as you can see, by focusing on the softness and refining more of those controlled blending techniques, I'm able to capture a high level of realism. The contrast plays such an important role, and although I've switched over to a very small detailed brush here to hint at some of those finer highlights, I'm making sure not to overdo it. Now, adding too much detail, we might feel actually increases that level of realism, but what can happen is it blocks out too much of the base layers underneath if we're working on a smaller size, and therefore then those details are actually a bit counterproductive. They can make that painting look less realistic and more two-dimensional. So we want to be making sure that we've got the balance just right. So now I've got all of the lights and darks established and I'm happy with the blend and softness, I can now start to work with glazes to adjust the colour. Now, as I've mentioned previously, I do have that specific glazing video here on YouTube, which is linked below. But my primary use of a glaze here is to work with a thin mixture, and I just use water to thin my paint, and I'm working with a transparent colour. A combination of transparent colours if we need to mix something very specific. But if I use opaque colours, such as lots of the titanium white in my glaze, or I make my glaze layer too thick and not enough water in that mixture, then it's actually going to cover up the layers underneath, which therefore then isn't acting as a glaze, we're just adding another layer on top. A glaze here in this situation should be transparent, very thin, so that I'm then able to see all of the layers underneath. Now usually I won't end my painting on a glazing layer, this isn't always the case. But once I've adjusted the colour with a first set of glazes, I then want to come back in and make sure that again my contrast is right. So this is where I might come back in and darken some shadows or brighten some highlights. Now, as you can see here, that's exactly what I'm doing. By adding more of my lighter layers, I am enhancing that shape and form, and therefore adding more of that three-dimensional look to my painting. What's really crucial though at this stage is that I don't start adding lots of random highlights where they're not needed. I do really want to make sure that I'm following that reference photo. Now, these alterations here may only take a few minutes, but they are certainly worth giving that time at this stage of the painting. Now, when you can see here that I add a layer of water with my fine mist spray bottle over the top, how much the colour saturation increases in vibrancy, and also how my darks look much darker and my highlights look much brighter. By adding a layer of water over the top at this stage, this is giving us a clear indication of how that painting's going to look when varnished. My gloss varnish is my preference. I really just love how it makes that look like it's difference between a photo printed on normal paper compared to one that's printed on photo paper. And the reason it's worthwhile doing this and adding this layer of water over the top, making sure your painting is dry before you do that, is that we can then assess whether or not we need to adjust anything before we do add a varnish. Because of course, once that varnish is added, we can't then remove it. So I want to be making sure that before I do that, I've got everything correct. And what I've done here is I've noticed that some of those highlights should be a little bit brighter. If I'd have varnished my painting and then realised that, unless I'm working with a varnish that can be removed, I can't make any adjustments such as this. So even at this stage, adding that water, although I was increasing the rays of light in the corner, it actually was a very valuable thing to do where I could then assess that value and that light source, making sure that it is just right before I call it finished. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help if I can. And if you are interested in painting along to the real-time version of this shark tutorial, or any of my other step-by-step lessons, I will link all of the information to those in the description below as well. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.